Good morning, children. Now, this month we will be doing a series on heroes of the Bible. I am sure you will recognize many of them. You would have heard stories about them before. You might be amazed at how faithful they are and the great things they have done. But I can assure you, they were only normal people like you and me, full of weaknesses as well as strengths. Today, we will be examining the life of Abraham. Have you heard this song before? Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Da, 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 da. Okay, there is truth in this song. Abraham is the ancestor of many people and people groups, such as the Hebrews, Arabs, Edomites, and Midianites. Most importantly, he is also the spiritual father of all followers of Jesus Christ. He is praised in the New Testament book of Hebrews for being a man of faith. Abraham's story begins in the book of Genesis at the end of chapter 11. We learn that he is at first called Abram, not Abraham. His father is Terah, his wife is Sarah, or Sarai as she was called then, and his nephew is Lot. Abraham is from the Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was a very important and rich city in that area of Mesopotamia during Abraham's time. Archaeologists have identified where this city is. Abraham's father Terah, as well as his ancestors, all worshipped false gods. Now, although long ago, God had destroyed the world with a flood because people were so evil, people had now again returned to worshipping pagan gods. Abraham is the 10th generation from Noah who had been saved by God from the flood. So God chose one man, Abraham, and called him out of his country in order to create from him one new nation. Through this nation, God would reveal his plan of salvation to the world. Abraham and his family journeyed from Ur to Haran, and after his father Terah passed away in Haran, Abraham obeyed God to leave Haran and continue his way to the land of Canaan. I'm sure it wasn't easy for Abraham to leave everything he had known to go to a new, unknown place. My family has shifted houses 10 times, and I can tell you it is not easy to go to the unknown. You need to get used to a new place, make new friends, and start everything over again. You also have to leave behind people and things you love. Yet Abraham had faith and followed God's calling, and his decision had long-term consequences. God had promised to one day bless the world through Abraham's family, and that was fulfilled when Jesus Christ came. But Abraham also had times when he didn't have faith in God. Because of a severe famine, Abraham left the land God had called him to and went down into Egypt. Trouble came from his time there, both immediately and much later. In Egypt, he told Sarah, his wife, to lie and say that she was his sister. Sarah was a beautiful woman, and Abraham was afraid that he would be killed if the Egyptians knew that she was his wife. He did not have enough faith in God to protect him. You remember, Abraham had a nephew named Lot? Well, both of them eventually became rich and had plenty of flocks and herds and tents. But there was not enough space in the land for them to stay together because they had so much possessions. The workers taking care of their flocks started quarreling with each other. Abraham had faith that God would give him the land as he had promised. He allowed Lot to have the first choice of which area of land he wanted to settle in instead of grabbing the best area of land for himself. When Lot was captured during the great battle between 4 kings versus 5 kings, Abraham bravely went to rescue his nephew with only 318 men from his household. The rescue was successful and Abraham recovered all the possessions and people who had been captured. However, he was not greedy and did not want to keep the wealth that belonged to the king of Sodom. He had faith that God would richly bless him. When God made a covenant with Abraham and said that his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky, Abraham had faith and believed what God told him, even though he still didn't have any children to inherit. Despite the amazing promise and vision God gave Abraham, his faith failed again and caused him to make the biggest mistake of his life. It was a mistake with consequences that last until today. Because she was still childless, Sarah offered her Egyptian maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and Sarah asked Abraham to sleep with Hagar so she could bear a child in Sarah's place. It was a common practice at that time, but it was clearly against God's design of one man and one woman in a marriage. Hagar's son Ishmael was not God's promised son. In the Middle East today, the descendants of Ishmael are still at war with the descendants of the son God had promised, which would be Isaac. You have probably heard the story of Sarah laughing when she overheard the 3 visitors telling Abraham that she will give birth to a son in a year's time. But are you aware that in a separate occasion before that, Abraham also laughed when God told him the same thing? This was the occasion when God told Abraham to circumcise all the males in his household. Abraham was 99 years old. It had already been 13 years since Ishmael was born. Sarah still had not born a child of her own. I personally think that Abraham had learned his lesson with Hagar and he wouldn't take things into his own hands again. But he had lost the firm faith in God's promise to make him the father of many nations and give him descendants as many as the stars in the sky. But Abraham did not learn his lesson in another area. When he was staying for a while in a place called Gerar, he again lied that Sarah was his sister and not his wife. And this time, it was the king of Gerar, Abimelech, who was fooled and suffered because of Abraham's lie. Abraham tried to justify himself that he hadn't really lied because Sarah was actually his half-sister as well as his wife. Abraham still did not have faith in God to protect him. The promised son, Isaac, was finally born just as God had said. But one day, God put Abraham's faith to the test. Was his faith in God or in what God had given him? God told him, "Take your son, your only son Isaac whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering." Abraham passed the test. Instead of holding on to what he loved, he was willing to surrender his son to God. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah that day. And many, many years later, God would actually sacrifice his own beloved son Jesus on that same mountain for the sins of the world. Abraham's decision that day would symbolize one day God's greatest sacrifice. As you have seen, Abraham was indeed a man of great faith, but he was also an ordinary human whose faith was also sometimes not so strong. That caused him to make some wrong decisions, and those decisions had consequences. You see, our actions today can start a series of events that may continue long after we are gone. And unfortunately, many times we only think of immediate consequences. Abraham's actions had both good and bad long-term consequences. What can we learn from Abraham? Let's look at the list of times when he was strong in his faith, and when his faith was weak. His faith was strong enough to leave his country when God called him. He allowed Lot to choose first. He refused to take a shortcut to become rich through the wealth of the king of Sodom. He trusted in God's promises even though they hadn't been fulfilled. He willingly gave up his only beloved son. However, his faith was weak and he lied both to the Egyptians as well as the people of Gerar. He took a shortcut to produce a son by agreeing to Sarah's offer of Hagar. He just laughed when God's promise had not been fulfilled after many years. How strong is your faith? Is your faith strong enough so you are prepared to leave your comfort zone in order to follow God as Abraham did? This could mean many things. He might ask you to leave your country and your family one day when you grow up in order to serve Him. He may also tell you to share the gospel with someone when this makes you nervous. He may ask you to be a friend with someone who is lonely, and therefore you will spend less time with your own circle of friends you are comfortable with. How strong is your faith to do things God's way instead of your own way? When we lack faith and lean on our own understanding, we mess things up. Don't try to come out with your own plan. Do things God's way. Abraham tried to help God with his plan to give him a son. The consequences of Abraham's sin last till today. How strong is your faith to trust God and not doubt in the darkness what God told you in the light? It would have been easy for Abraham to doubt when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. After all, how could God ask him to kill the child he had promised? But Abraham had confidence in God's character and knew God would not lead him the wrong way. There will be many times when we do not understand God's plan. He may not tell us what He wants us to do 10 years from now, but He will guide us to what we need to do today. Abraham's full story can be found in Genesis from chapter 12 to chapter 25. I strongly encourage you to take time this week to read these passages. And as you read, ask God to teach you from both Abraham's strengths and weaknesses. Thank you.